I was boys supervisor at St. Michael's Indian Residential School.
Where was St. Michael's?
Alert Bay, up at the northern part of Vancouver Island.
And what years did you?
1935 to 1938.
And what caused you to get into that line of work?
I don't really know. I guess it was because both my parents, my dad was an Englishman from England, and they settled in Winnipeg first. And then in 1905, my grandfather decided that, they were going to have homesteads up there, and he took his family there. And my dad was 17 when they came from England. So he would be about 22 when they went up there, and they went up there about 20 years after what they call the Frog Lake Massacre. And my dad worked with the Indians at Frog Lake. They used to call him the red-headed woodpecker because he would bring them to work by tapping his hammer on a tree. And his job was, they could build log cabins and that sort of stuff. They knew how to do it, but they didn't know how to chink them in, and he taught them that. And then my mother, she lived at a place in Alberta called Ponoka, and that was close to the Indian Reserve at Hobbema. And when she was young, she was companion to Mrs. Mann, the Indian agent's wife. She was an invalid, and my mom was just a very young person, and she was just to be her companion, to sit with her and read with her and that sort of stuff. And I guess hearing those stories is kind of what made me want to work with the Indians. And then I grew up in Manitoba, and the Indians would... They were a nomadic people, and they would travel from season to season. Like in the spring it would be berries, and I can remember them as a small child coming to our house with big buckets of Saskatoons and stuff, and they didn't want your old clothes. They wanted stuff like sugar and stuff like that, and I guess that's how it came about. And then I was always interested in people.
So what were those years at the school like? Did you enjoy them?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't trade that experience for all the experience I've had in my life since.
Really?
It was a good school. Like, there was approximately 200 children in school and 21 of us staff. And we worked for $30 a month, and our board was $35. So if money had been the incentive, we would never have stayed there. But we had more fun in our life then, and we never worked harder in our lives. But it was a good school, and the kids did accomplish stuff. Like, believe it or not, the girls had music lessons, some of the boys had violin lessons, some of the boys had piano lessons. One of our boys from St. Michael's, my time, he has an interest in an airline that flies out of Vancouver up to Bella Coola. No, they were encouraged to learn, and that they were told that they had 2 feet. One in the white man's world and one in the native world. And they had a head to direct them. And they did well. It was a good school.
Were the children happy to come there?
In our school, they were very happy. I don't remember them ever being too unhappy. It's only like some of them that went through our school, I read in the paper, where now they complain about going to St. Michael's. But at the time, they were glad to be there. And I think the reason they complain now is because there's so many other people from Indian schools complaining. But even the most disgruntled of them will tell you that they appreciated their schooling, because where would they be without those schools? I wouldn't say they were perfect, but they were necessary, but they weren't handled properly by the government. And the churches stepped in, and they filled in where the government fell down. Like, the government said Indian residential schools, but it was the churches that went to work and built them and put the children in the schools. And where a lot of them get the bad name now is, they always blamed the principals of the school going around and gathering up the children and taking them to the schools. Well, it wasn't the principals of the school, it was the Indian agent. He would just go in and take them and put them in school whether they liked it or not. And some of them, their first year in school, would complain they didn't like it, but when they went home for the summer holidays, they couldn't get back fast enough because they would have 3 full meals a day and a bath. And I mean, I've heard many of them say they couldn't get home fast enough or get back to school fast enough. So, you know, it's... I never heard any complaints when I was at St. Michael's about Indian schools until about the last 25 years. I mean, it's been coming out in the paper. We never knew such things, you know, what was going on. It wouldn't have happened in our school anyway, because our Mr. Anfield was one of the finest men that ever worked with Native children. Yeah.
I have heard there were some good schools, and it sounds like yours was one of them.
Well, St. Michael's was the role model for all Indian schools.
Right.
And the next one was St. Mary's Mission, just across the river. That was Oblate.
Were the children allowed to speak their own language, or were they
We never ever stopped them from speaking their own language. Some of the children that were in school in my time, since they've grown up and since I've seen them later, especially the girls, they say they were never punished for speaking their own language, but they were stopped. But we never stopped the boys.
Right, so they were allowed. What about their own culture? And it sounds like with the Indian carving that they were...
Well, as I say, Mr. Anfield hired the best native carvers ever, like Mungo Martin. He had a little shack on the school property where he taught them totem pole carving, and then when he didn't want... Charlie James was the first one, and when Charlie got too old to do it, Mungo Martin came in. And then Mungo Martin, he refurbished all the totem poles in Victoria. He had over there at Thunderbird Park, he refurbished all those. So we had the best carvers going. And they did native painting. They did, did rug making, that sort of stuff. And they were very artistic. And the manual training instructor there, he encouraged them to put their own designs into things that they did. And we sent an exhibit down to Vancouver in my years there, and it's on display in the Indian part of the PNE grounds right now, of small cedar chests, small totem poles that they made. And it got the first prize that year. I think it was about 1936 or 37, and a man by the name of Herbert Norden was the manual training instructor, and I mean, they did some fabulous work.
So the kids were coming out with a decent education.
Yeah, well, they only went to grade 8.
Yeah.
And then you see, once they finished grade 8, they weren't allowed to go to the white school in Alert Bay. If they went on further, we had to send them down to Vancouver. And then they would go to high school in Vancouver. They weren't very happy about going to school in Victoria, but they went to high school in Vancouver. Majority of them did.
Why weren't they allowed to go?
Well, I mean, there was the color barrier. It was only when about 1956 is when they could go into the public school system. And then a lot of the natives moved down to Vancouver so that their children could take, full use of the public school system. Mr. Anfield lobbied for that. He helped them get it. By that time, he was Indian agent in Prince Rupert. But
so did most of the other staff share your feelings about Native?
We were a very congenial staff. I mean, we had very little disagreement. Like since 1982, we've had several reunions, and it's been mostly the people of my years there. And it's surprising how many of us are still around, and the kids all seem to come and want to come. Yeah. But it's Mr. Anfield, he seemed to. There were, as I say, almost 200 children in the school. He seemed to study every one of them. He seemed to know what everyone was capable of doing. Like, I remember one boy, he's a grandfather now, Vivian Wilson, he said, I was interested in being the best fisherman that I could be. But he says, I didn't realize when I was studying, learning that kind of stuff and learning music lessons that I could also do other things in business, because now he has a share in an airline called Waglicio that flies out of Vancouver going to Bella Coola. He said, Mr. Anfield knew what we all wanted. He says, and he never ever let us down. We didn't have to use corporal punishment. It was unheard of. I think we would have had our walking ticket if we'd have punished any of them. We didn't feel we had to. But then, as I say, it was a congenial bunch of people. It was 21 people. We got along very well. We had differences, but we didn't go to bed mad at each other. We would kind of reason it out because, as I say, we had to, well, it was a different period of time. And money wasn't as important as it is now.
Were the conditions very tough for you? What kind of hours did you work in a day?
You got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and every other day you were on duty till 10 o'clock at night. You had what you call dormitory duty, but you had a couple of hours off in the morning when you were on those long days. And then you had one day off a month and half a day a week. And it wasn't hard. And your spare time, half the time your spare time, you were still working for the Indian children. Like the kids had music lessons, they had sewing lessons, they had art lessons, they had all kinds of things. But there was no extra staff hired. It was all the things that we knew, the extra things that we could do. Like in the village, I helped with a CGIT group. And then I had the junior WA in the village. But we didn't bring in extra people. We just used our own talents, and the girls that could teach music taught music. The girls that could sew, they taught. Well, we had a seamstress. She was a very good sewer and a good seamstress. She had studied in England, and she taught the girls a lot of things. And then we had a good woman. The kitchen maid was a very fine woman. She taught the girls how to cook. The girls had to do kitchen duty. The boys had to do farm duty. They learned how to farm. The senior students were in school half a day. They worked on the farm, and they went in classroom half a day. The girls worked in the kitchen and in school half a day, but the little ones were in school all day. But they learned to farm. They learned that how to rotate a crop. The boys did. The girls had to learn how to cook for 200 kids, and our food was more or less the same as the children. They had very good food. 3 times a week, the native children had their own diet. We fed them seaweed, oolican oil, and that sort of stuff, and that cut down the TV rate. We didn't. They needed that to serve. Because when you take them away from their own diet, they don't do as well. And when we started that, they did very, very well. And then when the boys left school, they usually went fishing or were part of a fishing crew. When Mr. Anfield financed a lot of those boys to their own seine boat. And never, ever once did they ever let him down. They always paid him back. Always. He never had to go after him. They considered it a trust. And some of the girls, even some of them worked on the staff after they left school. Some of the girls worked on staff after they left school. And they were glad to do it. And I know my husband was a wireless operator. And we spent 1 year after I was married, we went from Alert Bay to Prince Rupert, just to the wireless station at Digby Island. Well, in the summer holidays, that would be in 1940, Mr. Anfield let me have one of the girls that lived at Metlakatla. That was just across the water from where I lived. She lived with me for the 2 months of the summer. And then there was one of the staff was going back to Manitoba to go to university there to learn shoe repairing. And he took one of the students with him, and that student lived with my father and mother in Winnipeg for 2 months. So it was a different period of time where people, but 60 years ago too, when I think back, the Indians they had lost their pride because of the way they had been, and they were just beginning to get it back. And the results are showing now. They're proud of who they are and what they can do. And the residential schools have helped them do that.